Welcome to Anews. I'm Taslim, and you're watching Turkey's Diplomacy. As Turkey launches a historic push to end 4 decades of PKK violence and the world marks 80 years since Hiroshima's devastation, new threats of nuclear escalation hang over Gaza. Today, I'll be breaking down Turkey's bold disarmament roadmap, the latest developments from Ukraine, and Israel's ongoing massacres in the occupied Gaza Strip.
Türkiye has taken a historic step in its long-running fight against terrorism, with the newly formed Parliamentary Commission convening its first meeting on Tuesday to begin drafting a roadmap for the disarmament of the PKK terrorist group. The commission, which includes representatives from parties in parliament, marks a rare moment of political consensus around one of the country's most sensitive security issues. The move comes amid rising momentum behind the government's Terror-Free Türkiye initiative, which seeks a comprehensive and sustainable solution to the PKK's nearly 4-decade terrorism.
There are moments in the history of nations that shape not only the present, but also the future of nations. Today, we are experiencing one of such days. We all see that a historic turning point has been reached in ridding our nation of the scourge of terrorism, which has plagued it for half a century.
The Commission's mandate includes drafting legal proposals to support a possible disarmament process, including amendments to Turkey's anti-terror laws and revisions to the law on the execution of penalties. According to sources close to the process, preliminary proposals are expected by October, when Parliament returns from recess. This legislative push follows a surprising shift within the PKK earlier this year, as its imprisoned ringleader called for an end to armed struggle and urged the group to pursue its goals through democratic and legal channels. The statement, issued in May, admitted the failure of separatist ambitions and hinted at a willingness to rejoin society under Turkey's constitutional order. While Turkish officials have welcomed peaceful solutions, they have been clear that any process must be absolute, unconditional, and fully aligned with the rule of law.
Türkiye'yi yeniden şekillenen küresel sistemde bölgesinin kutupbaşı ülkesi haline getirme mücadelemiz, kurulan tuzaklara, içeriden ve dışarıdan gelen saldırılara rağmen devam ediyor.
The Terror-Free Türkiye initiative aims to not only eliminate terrorism but also address the social and economic wounds left by years of conflict. It promotes national unity through dialogue, disarmament, and reforms, especially in regions heavily affected by violence. Officials say the initiative will include measures for reintegration, legal clarity, and regional development. If successful, the plan could mark the beginning of a new era in Türkiye, one that replaces armed conflict with peace, reconciliation, and long-term national strength.
Güvenlikten demokrasiye, ekonomiden teknolojiye, savunma sanayinden dış politikaya uzanan geniş bir alanda milletimizin istikbalini güvenceye alacak tarihi nitelikte adımlar atıyoruz.
Welcome back to the program. Anews editor Mustafa Kojakanar, thanks for being with us in the studio today.
Good morning, Umar.
Mustafa, let's start with the Terror-Free Türkiye initiative. Now, the Parliamentary Commission, which is overseeing the dismantling of the PKK, convened its first meeting on Tuesday. Tell me more about this meeting, Mustafa. Let's start with that first.
Umar, I think if we want to understand the current situation in Turkey right now, I think we have to analyze the process. And as you know, PKK terror group launched its terror campaign against Turkey's national security in 1984. And since then, we know that PKK terrorists have been responsible for the deaths of more than 40,000 people, including civilians. And Turkish security forces have been giving no respite to PKK terror group within and beyond Turkey's borders. And it is evident that Turkish security forces successfully eradicating PKK terror threat within the borders. And shifting regional dynamics pushed the PKK ringleaders to think about PKK terror group's future. And last year, as you know, Turkey's opposition Nationalist Movement Party leader Devlet Bahçeli proposed a terror-free Turkey initiative, and since then both the ruling AK Party and opposition parties have been taking important steps to realize the terror-free Turkey initiative. And in February this year, PKK's jailed ringleader Abdullah Öcalan urged the separatist terror group to lay down its weapons and dissolve itself. And within this context, in May, PKK terror group announced its dissolution and decision to lay down their weapons. And last month, we witnessed that some PKK terrorists lay down their weapons in northern Iraq's Süleymaniye province. And as you know, Turkish security forces have been also meticulously monitoring the latest developments about the PKK's dissolution process. And within this context, Turkish Parliament also established a commission to closely monitor the latest developments about the dissolution of the PKK terror group. And yesterday, commission firstly convened in Turkey's capital, Ankara. It is expected that the commission will lay down the legal frameworks for the PKK's dissolution. Turkish Parliament Speaker Numan Kurtulmuş yesterday praised Commission's efforts to bring peace and stability to Turkey. Turkish Parliament Speaker Numan Kurtulmuş reiterated Turkey's strong determination to get rid of the terrorism scourge, and it is evident that Turkish security forces and political leaders are determined right now to eliminate terror threat within and beyond Turkey's borders. On the other hand, yesterday, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan also visited Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's mausoleum in Ankara, and President Erdoğan reiterated his government's determination to ensure Turkey's political stability and territorial integrity and economic prosperity. And right now, many other political parties are also supporting terror-free Turkey initiative. They are sending delegations to the commission established by the Turkish parliament in terms of monitoring the latest developments about the PKK's dissolution. And it is right now projected that terror-free Turkey initiative will also help the government realize a century of Turkey vision.
Mustafa, we're living in a very volatile region, right? And next month, Syria is going to be holding parliamentary elections. Now, how important are these elections, Mustafa, under the leadership of President Ahmed al-Shara, and how much will these elections help Syria rebuild?
Omar, as you know, there had been ongoing civil wars in Syria for 14 years, but last December, opposition forces led by Ahmed al-Shara took control over the country as the country's long-time ruling family, Assad family, fled to Russia. And new geopolitical era clearly began for Syria's future. And since then, new rulers in Damascus have been taking important steps in terms of normalizing the political situation in the war-torn country. As you know, Ahmed al-Shara is leading the interim government right now, and the country is preparing to hold parliamentary elections this year. As you know, Turkey has been one of the most important countries in terms of reiterating its strong support for Syria's territorial integrity, political stability, and unitary structure. As we know, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan welcomed his Syrian counterpart, Ahmed al-Shara, several times to Istanbul, Ankara, and Antalya this year to discuss what can be done in terms of ensuring Syria's long-time political stability. And Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan reaffirmed Turkey's strong support for Syria's efforts to rebuild and reconstruct the country. On the other hand, Turkish decision makers have been also in close contact with their counterparts from all around the world to lift the sanctions on Syria. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan held a phone conversation with his American counterpart Donald Trump, and in May, as you know, Trump paid an official visit to Middle Eastern countries. He visited Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and United Arab Emirates, and on the sidelines of the Gulf Cooperation Council summit in Saudi Arabia's capital, Riyadh, Trump also met with his Syrian counterpart Ahmed al-Shara, and following his meeting with Shara, Trump decided to remove sanctions for Syria. And European nations are also following the United States paths in terms of lifting sanctions on Syria, because we know that Syria desperately needs international help to rebuild and reconstruct the war-torn country. And right now, Syria is preparing to hold parliamentary elections. I think that it will pave the way for the political stability and economic prosperity for Syria. And I think that within this process, Turkish decision makers, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, have been always in contact with their Syrian counterparts. I think that cooperation and collaboration between Ankara and Damascus will yield positive results in terms of ensuring tranquility for Syrian people.
Mustafa, now dynamics have changed in Syria over the past few months, ever since we entered the new year. Now, Mustafa, whatever happens in Syria directly and indirectly impacts Turkey, right? And the dynamics have changed completely. There's a new geopolitical situation as well. The European Union and the United States have removed sanctions. There was the threat of the YPG, which Turkey has been facing for a very long time. And then there was the political instability because we saw the civil war, 14 years of civil war. Refugees came into Turkey. Now, in what other ways is Turkey trying to help Syria, Mustafa? Because Turkey has said that it will supply it with energy resources. Then there's going to be investments, new businesses, new Turkish businesses are going to open in Syria. Tell me more about this, Mustafa. How is Turkey viewing a post-civil war Syria at this point?
Well, Turkey has been trying to strengthen its bilateral or multilateral cooperation with Syria. And within this context, Turkey's decision makers have been always reaffirming Turkey's strong support for new rulers in Damascus' efforts to rebuild and reconstruct the country. As you know, Turkey has been trying to increase international awareness about Syria's political realities and situation. Turkish decision makers have been in close contact with their counterparts from all around the world to help Syria rebuild and reconstruct the country. On the other hand, Turkish leaders have been also trying to help Syria to rebuild the war-torn country's political and military infrastructure. Turkish military forces have been in close contact with their Syrian counterparts to ensure the country's political stability and territorial integrity. On the other hand, Turkey has been trying to reiterate its strong support for Syria's infrastructure efforts. As you know, last week Turkey started to supply gas for Syria, and it will increase electricity capacity for Syrian provinces. And it is evident that the cooperation between Turkey and Syria is yielding positive results in terms of making life for Syrians easier, because right now Syrians desperately need international help to get their life normal. And it is crystal clear that Turkey's strong support for Syria's efforts to rebuild and reconstruct the country will also help the Syrian people return to their homeland.
Mustafa, now let's discuss the war in Ukraine. Steve Witkoff, the U.S. envoy, is in Moscow. He has met the leadership over there. Now, Russia is demanding demilitarized zones. Zelensky says he's not ready to cede territory to Russia. Mustafa, what's going on here? Now, do you think that the visit of Steve Witkoff is going to bring about a ceasefire? Do you think anything can happen in that, in those areas, in that domain? Because a ceasefire is needed at this point, and the latest reports have said that over 500,000 people have been killed in this war between Russia and Ukraine. So what's the latest over there, Mustafa?
Omar, to be honest, I think we have to analyze the United States' position in terms of ending war between Ukraine and Russia. And as you know, last year, during his presidential campaign, Donald Trump promised to end war between Ukraine and Russia within 24 hours. And he started his second presidency in the White House in January. And right now we are in August, and we know that the conflicts between Ukraine and Russia are raging on in the Eastern Europe right now. And it is showing that Trump failed to promise his foreign policy goals. And as you know, last month, Trump decided to send Patriot defense system to Ukraine to defend itself against Russian aggression. And since January, the Trump administration has been always calling for cessation of the conflicts between Ukraine and Russia and immediate ceasefire. Within this context, U.S. delegations met with both Ukrainian and Russian teams to discuss what can be done in terms of reaching a ceasefire or peace deal. But right now we know that the war is raging on in the Eastern Europe. Turkey's Istanbul hosted several rounds of peace negotiations between Ukrainian and Russian delegations. At the end of May, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio also came to Istanbul to participate in the peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. We know that these negotiations didn't yield positive results in terms of ensuring a peace deal or ceasefire, but we know that these negotiations are contributing to confidence-building measures among warring parties. On the other hand, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has been always calling for leader-to-leader diplomacy, and Turkish decision makers have been trying to bring Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Russian leader Vladimir Putin, and U.S. President Donald Trump together in Turkey's Istanbul or Ankara to finalize the ceasefire deal or peace agreement. But we know that there are different demands coming from both sides right now. As you mentioned, Russia is always calling upon the Ukrainian side to give up its political sovereignty and territorial integrity. On the other hand, Ukrainian decision makers are calling upon their Russian counterparts to withdraw the Russian forces from the occupied territories. And I think that these different security demands need to be reconciled by the regional and international stakeholders. And it is evident that right now it is up to Turkey to facilitate or mediate the diplomatic talks between two warring sides, because we know that Turkey has been enjoying close relationships with both Ukraine and Russia in many fields ranging from politics and economy to military and trade. Turkey's bilateral ties with Ukraine and Russia and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's bilateral relationships with his Ukrainian counterpart and Russian counterpart, I think will help Turkey mediate or facilitate peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. I think that if the leaders convene in Istanbul or Ankara, maybe it will pave the way for the cessation of the wars.
Mustafa, today is the 6th of August, and in 1945, the United States bombed Hiroshima. Now, 145,000 people were killed by the end of that year. We saw the devastation. President Harry Truman ordered the bombing of Hiroshima, and we saw the disasters even after that. Now, to this day, we're seeing people who are suffering from diseases like cancer, and they have diseases that are not treatable. They're untreatable diseases. You know, Mustafa, this anniversary that we're celebrating today, it just shows us how dangerous conflicts are. Look at Russia and Ukraine. Look at India and Pakistan. Look at Israel and Palestine. Now, we don't know how many nuclear weapons the Israelis have, but reports say they do have a lot of nuclear weapons. Mustafa, then there's a debate about nuclearization versus denuclearization. What's your view on this, considering what's going on across the world today? Do you think that nuclearization is more important than denuclearization?
But as you mentioned, Japan today is commemorating the 80th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And as you know, 80 years ago, United States dropped atomic bombs in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and atomic bombings paved the way for the end of the Second World War. And since then, there have been discussions among international relations scholars over the denuclearization or nuclearization efforts. Right now, we know that there are 9 nations in the world having nuclear weapons, and 5 of them are legitimate nuclear powers. And these nations are the United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, and Russia. And these are also permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. On the other hand, we know that North Korea, India, Pakistan, and Israel have also nuclear weapons. Israel didn't announced to the world that they have nuclear weapons, but it is a well-known secret by the international community. And some international relations scholars are arguing that all countries should get a nuclear bomb if we want to avoid wars between nations. They are citing a political situation between India and Pakistan to legitimize their ideas over the nuclearization, because we know that before nuclear weapons, India and Pakistan fought with each other several times. But after the nuclear weapons, they are hesitating to deepen their military confrontation. As you know, this year, Pakistan and India fought each other over the terrorism issue in India. Both sides accused each other of increasing geopolitical tensions, but thanks to nuclear weapons, both Indian and Pakistani decision makers hesitated to deepen their military confrontation. And these international scholars claim that nuclear weapons will be beneficial in terms of avoiding direct military confrontations between nations. But on the other hand, some nations, particularly Japan, have been always calling for denuclearization. As you know, there has been nuclear non-proliferation treaty, and many members are being side of the NPT, and they declare that they will not acquire nuclear weapons, and they are eager to develop nuclear energy for peaceful reasons. On the other hand, as you know, there is an ongoing dispute between United States and Iran over Iran's nuclear program. Trump has been always reiterating that Iran is in a nuclear threshold, and the Middle Eastern country will have nuclear weapons. On the other hand, Iranians claim that they are not seeking nuclear weapons. I think that these discussions among international relations scholars and nations will continue, but long story short, I think that nuclearization will be helpful for avoiding direct military confrontations between great powers.
Well, so that was a very interesting analysis on nuclearization versus denuclearization. Thank you so much for that. We'll be right back with you. The United Nations Security Council convened to discuss the future of Gaza with sharp warnings over a possible Israeli military expansion, renewed Palestinian calls for withdrawal and reconstruction, and divided views on statehood and diplomatic efforts to end the conflict.
So the latest reports regarding Prime Minister Netanyahu's possible decision to expand Israel's military operations through the entire Gaza Strip, if true, are deeply alarming. This would risk catastrophic consequences for millions of Palestinians and could further endanger the lives of the remaining hostages in Gaza.
Our call remains unchanged nearly 670 days later. End this Israeli war of massacres and starvation against our people. Release the hostages and prisoners. Enable immediate, unimpeded humanitarian aid to Gaza, including by the UN humanitarian system, including UNRWA, and secure full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza so that the Palestinian government can assume sole governance and security responsibilities with regional and international support, and we can begin immediately the recovery and reconstruction process based on the internationally endorsed Arab OIC plan and move towards finally ending this illegal occupation and achieving a just peace.
We must be clear that unproductive publicity stunts like last week's two-state solution conference and unilateral announcements regarding recognition of a Palestinian state undercut the efforts of mediators and prolong the war. These gifts to Hamas not only imperil the hostages, they also hurt the civilians of Gaza who continue to suffer what President Trump has recognized as real starvation.
As my Prime Minister set out last week, the UK is ready to play its full and historic part in achieving a plan which ends the bloodshed, brings the hostages home, and lays the foundation for a Palestinian state. Statehood is the inalienable right of the Palestinian people and is essential to the long-term security of Israel.
Welcome back to the program. Now let's take a look at the front page of Daily Sabah. Mustafa, we were talking about the terror-free initiative in Türkiye, but we know that threats are emanating in the region from countries like Iraq and Syria. Tell me more about this, Mustafa. How close are we to achieving a terror-free region?
Mar, I can clearly say that PKK terror group is not only posing a huge threat to Turkey's political stability and territorial integrity, as they are active in northern Iraq and northern Syria. They're also posing a huge threat to regional peace and security. As you know, PKK terror group's Syrian offshoot, PYD-YPG, benefited from the geopolitical vacuum during the civil war years in Syria, and United States bolstered these terrorists to deal with the Daesh problem in the region. But we know that Turkey reiterates its every opportunity that one terror group cannot be defeated by using another one. And United States support for PYD-YPG is also poisoning the bilateral relationships between two important NATO members. And Turkey has been always calling for regional solutions for regional problems. And within this context, Turkey is expecting concrete steps from Iraq and Syria to deal with the terror threat problem across the borders. As you know, Turkey conducted several counter-terrorism operations, both northern Iraq and northern Syria, to not only secure its borders, also bring peace and stability to these countries. And as you know, Iraq is eager to give its strong support for Turkey's fight against terrorism. On the other hand, as we mentioned, Turkey and Syria right now have been enjoying close relationships, and both countries are respecting their political sovereignty and territorial integrity. As we mentioned about terror-free Turkey initiative, I think terror-free Turkey initiative is also meaning for terror-free region. I think that Turkey's new diplomatic and security steps will pave the way for the regional peace and stability in the Middle East.
Mustafa, thanks for that analysis and update on the latest top headlines from Daily Sabah. We'll continue to monitor all these stories.
Thank you, Mark.
Now let's take a look at the top stories from the occupied Gaza Strip, where food and starvation crisis is worsening.
Desperate Palestinians swarmed aid trucks entering Gaza on Tuesday, clambering over vehicles and jostling for food amid mounting hunger and deteriorating humanitarian conditions across the war-torn enclave. The chaotic scenes unfolded near the southern city of Khan Yunis, where crowds gathered at the Morag corridor, one of the few crossings where aid has sporadically entered. Footage showed people scaling aid trucks and seizing supplies as others looked on helplessly. Several were reportedly injured in the rush, and at least one person was said to have died in the chaos. Despite repeated pledges by Israel to facilitate humanitarian aid, including recent measures allowing some deliveries via private merchants, residents and aid workers say the flow remains dangerously inadequate. Gaza's health ministry and the United Nations warn the region is on the brink of full-scale famine, with children and the elderly most at risk. The situation has grown even more dire as large areas of northern and central Gaza remain cut off by ongoing military operations. Local authorities say coordination with aid agencies is sporadic and insufficient, and distribution is often carried out under the threat of violence. Hamas officials, meanwhile, have offered to allow aid transfers to Israeli hostages in exchange for humanitarian corridors and a pause in airstrikes, though negotiations on the proposal have yet to bear fruit. Human rights groups continue to call for an immediate ceasefire and a large-scale increase in aid access, warning that without urgent action, Gaza's humanitarian collapse will deepen further in the coming days.
Joining us now from the French capital is Mideast political analyst Dr. Abdunnour Toumi. Dr. Toumi, welcome to the program.
Good morning and greeting to you and Dr. Mustafa and your viewers.
Thank you. Dr. Toomey, I want to start by asking you about the recent meeting that was held by Israeli intel chiefs and former army heads. Now, they have said that this is a genocide, the atrocities that Israel has been conducting in the occupied Gaza Strip. They've labeled it a genocide. But don't you think it's too late? Because 60,000 people have been killed and over 2 million people have been displaced.
And this is, I mean, a direct answer to the word that the Israeli Prime Minister doesn't care about the loss of the Palestinians on one hand, and also about the international law and international humanitarian laws, and so on. And this is, it's in his strategic objective is to not only eradicate, quote unquote, as he put it, or he has been saying, or lying to the world for the last 2 years about Hamas, is to eradicate the Palestinians, and with it the Palestinian cause, and pushing the Palestinian forced exile, following his carnage that is taking place, or has been taking place now for 2 years, and also the ethnic cleansing and so on. Not to mention these starvation policy and the famine that is caused by his policies. And this is not a famine as a result of a drought or a natural disaster. It is a man provocation, and also is to again make an end to the Palestinians. So the question is, does he continue, and how far he can go, and where is the international committee and the community? And again, anytime I'm on your Respect for Disagreement show, I mean, I ask this question: where is the international committee? What the international committee needs to do? And unfortunately, he hasn't. The international committee didn't act, and this is what, as a result of, I mean, those policies or this starvation and genocide and all these war crimes that are committed on the Palestinian people is not only in Gaza, I mean, even in the West Bank and in the Quds Sharif and so on. And we saw that now there are those fanatics and extremist religious in Zionist Christians also in the U.S. are, politicians, I mean, showing up to the occupied West Bank and showing full support and unconditional support for the Israelis to continue their atrocities, and quoting from the Bible as if the Bible is a registry of land or a boundary plan. So now we are again, the world is waiting for the meeting of tomorrow on Israeli's cabinet about how he will launch a full-scale occupation of Gaza.
Dr. Toomey, that's exactly what I wanted to ask you next. Now, these Israeli reports have said, and then there's a meeting as well tomorrow, do you think that Netanyahu is going to fully occupy the Gaza Strip and expel the Palestinians? Because we've seen, and you've mentioned it clearly, that the international community has shown no action whatsoever. International organizations have also failed to protect the Palestinians. Do you think that Netanyahu will go ahead with these plans?
I think he does, and he has been occupying Gaza for now 2 months, and not to mention the blockade that was imposed on Gaza Strip since 2007. I mean, we are talking about Gaza Strip as if we are talking about the Swiss canton, like, they were enjoying life and having this fondue and so on. No, I mean, it was the Palestinian people in Gaza were going through terrible, harsh policies as a result of the blockade before the October 7 Al-Aqsa flood operation. And now it's clear, I mean, there is nothing left in Gaza. And when we talk about occupation, I mean, the Israelis are already occupying more than 90% of the lands, and nothing left in Gaza. I mean, literally, his policies did obliterate the Gaza. So, and now it's, again, where is the international community? And by the way, I mean, I am allowed, and I am asking people, friends and academicians, journalists, and French people, and even my neighbor, he's just a bus driver, he asked me, what are the Arabs? I mean, even the Arabs, and not to mention the Arab people, I mean, the leaders, and who saw that the Muslim leaders, and what are the Muslim community, what are the Muslim leaders? I mean, now to see these set images day in, day out, and the people showing up with a pot, an empty pot, and just to get a job or a spoon of watery blood. I mean, and people are not, again, and Gaza wasn't hit by a hurricane. It's not a famine, natural disaster, famine. It is a war going on. It is a genocide is going on. This is why the international community has to show up, has to speak up. And then when we speak about occupation, I mean, nothing left. I mean, on the other hand, the Americans also, I mean, they are, again, when you hear, like, maybe Israeli Prime Minister, he gets a green light. No, I mean, he has the key of the truck with this bulldozer, with a full tank of diesel, and just go on and drive through. So this is why today the international community has to step up and to say enough is enough. And so there are these awakening, these mobilities of the public opinions who are taking the street and speaking up, showing full support for the Palestinians, whether in Australia, in Australia, Europe, and in South America. This is good, but the public opinion has leverage, but the big, the pressure has to come from Arab leaders who weigh in a great deal in America's geopolitics in the region, and to make pressure on them and to end this carnage.
Dr. Toumi, over the past few days, we've been seeing videos of the Israeli hostages, and the international community says it's outraged. That was not the reaction when they saw the images of the Palestinians starving, who have had no food for months. Now, we've been talking about these hostages, right? There are Palestinian prisoners as well in Israeli jails. Around 9,500 prisoners are being held. Palestinian prisoners. We shouldn't even be calling them prisoners, because most of them have been detained without any charges, without any legal proceedings. What happens to them, Dr. Toumi? Because they're being ignored. The spotlight is on the Israeli hostages, but we should know that many Palestinians, thousands of Palestinians, are still detained by the Israeli government.
And again, this is the double standard policy that has been going on for decades. And this is that the Westerners, especially the Western leaders, who have been buying the Israeli narrative that, the narrative of victimization, and Israel has the right to defend itself, and so on. But, ignoring totally the other side. The people who are suffering occupation, harsh occupation and acculturation processes that have been going on for decades, for more than 7 decades now. So this is why when we hear the leader from the West, there is always, a statement, but there is but. Follows with the but. So no, there is no but. You have to take serious decision if you are sincere about, for instance, for the two-state solutions. There is no such a thing called two-state solutions, because, as I said, I think in the previous show, the other side doesn't recognize the Palestinians as a people, as an entity. So how do you see it with someone who ignores you?
Dr. Toumi, thank you for that analysis. It was a pleasure having you on the program, as always.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Anews editor Mustafa Kocakinar, thank you so much for being with us in the studios.
Thank you very much.
That brings us to the end of our program. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.